I know the plans, child, plans I have for you.
Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of Sermon and Song with Blue in the Face. I'm Chris Catalano and I'm going to talk to you about all things love of God until I'm, well, blue in the face. Today's topic, does God really have a plan for me? When I was a kid, I used to love to do connect the dots puzzles. Sometimes with the really good ones, you couldn't figure out what the final image was going to be until the very end. In fact, I think that's what made them so much fun. It was only when you were all done and you got to see the very end that you could step back and say, ah, that's what that is. That's really cool. When I started reflecting on that this week, I realized how much of our faith journey is really like a connect the dots puzzle. There are all of these dots before us that represent different moments and stories and experiences in our lives. Some of them are faced very far apart, others really close together. And as we journey from story to story and event to event, an image is being formed that's the picture of our lives. Many times along the way, we get a beautiful glimpse of what the picture is becoming, but we're not always aware of how each of the dots relate to one another. God, who created the artwork and the mysterious dots, is our silent partner working with and in us, leading us to find deeper meaning in all of it. I'm always amazed as I get older just how much the dots become related to one another. In God's great economy, none of it ever seems to get wasted. The dots and experiences all start to relate to each other after a while. I mean, think about it. How many times have you had the experience of meeting someone at one point in your life, perhaps it seemed insignificant at the time, only to have that relationship take on a much deeper meaning for you at a later time? You couldn't have known on the day you met how important that person would become later on, sometimes even years later. Sometimes this is how people wind up working in a particular job, for example. It was a meeting from a while ago, or the seemingly insignificant friend of a friend that connected the infamous dots. Nothing gets wasted in God's economy. Sometimes our suffering is a connect the dots experience too. We endure great suffering at one point in our lives. The Lord in His great goodness sees us through. Then later on, we find out how important our suffering was going to be in another context, because we learned something tremendously important, or we can pay it forward to someone else in a similar situation. Or perhaps it leads us in a particular life's vocational direction because of our experience of suffering. Often when we do a connect the dots puzzle, it's easy to see the connection between the dots or stories that are very close in distance. But if you notice, the puzzle dots and the lines between them are sometimes very long and far apart. So too it is with us when our experiences and stories from many years before connect with something years and years later. And then we say, ah, that's cool, I get it now. Didn't know how or why that was going to be important then, but I see it now. Nice picture, God. All of this speaks of a God who's very interested and connected to His people, enough so that He chose to take on our very flesh in the person of Jesus Christ. He wrapped Himself around our suffering, clothed Himself in our physical pain, experienced our emotional trauma, knew our grief and loss, our empty longings, all to connect with our dots, journeying from dot to dot with us. Now, it wasn't enough for God just to create the artwork. In love, He needed to walk with us from dot to dot, defining an entirely new picture of a future with hope and beauty, all shaped by his divine hands. In God's economy, nothing is wasted. All of it comes to have the greatest of purpose and meaning if we allow it to be shaped by his detailed and specific plans for us. This same God who calls us by name, which implies a deep relationship to us, reminds us through the prophet Jeremiah, "For I know well the plans I have in mind for you, plans for your welfare and not for woe, so as to give you a future of hope." This is a God who clearly wants not only to be involved with his people, he chose to be one of his people. Can't get much closer than that. He just couldn't resist the urge to love us that much. Thankfully, we never have to do our journey alone. Not only are we called to remind one another of the nearness of God as our hands extend his blessings to one another, Jesus tells us at his ascension when he commissioned his disciples to go forth, "And behold, I am with you always until the end of the age." This sounds to me like a God who is well invested in his people for all time. So it would stand to reason, if you've noticed the many times in the present that God connected an earlier dot in your life with a later significance, it would seem to tell us that God is always ahead of us. He's always working on our tomorrows today. If he connected the past with meaning today, then God, who is a living, dynamic God, is already doing the same thing for your tomorrows. All we have to do is follow the divine plan from dot to dot, trusting that the image God is creating in our lives is indeed the masterpiece of love he always intended it to be. St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians perhaps said it best. "For we are his handiwork, created in Christ Jesus for the good works that God has prepared in advance, that we should live in them." Connecting your dots. Allow the dot-to-dot experience of your Christian journey to connect to the love of Jesus who was, is, and will always be shaping your picture with love. Yes, you are God's work of art. Now frame it with beauty and grace.
No, I know the plans, child, plans I have for you.
This is a song I wrote in 2004 called Jeremiah's Lullaby. Verse 1 is based on the scripture from Jeremiah I quoted earlier. May it bring you hope in our God who has a specific plan and a future for your life, and always will.